June 9, 1944. 3 kilometers west of Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy. A 16-year-old farm boy crouched in the remains of his family's barn, staring at a haystack through a cracked window. American paratroopers had told him to evacuate 12 hours ago. They'd be back to clear the village by noon, they said. But Pierre Dubois hadn't left, and that decision was about to save 63 lives. The officers called him insane. The local resistance leader said he was a fool risking his neck for nothing. But Pierre had seen something in the early morning light, something that made his stomach drop. A glint of metal where there shouldn't be metal. Movement in the tree line where the Germans had supposedly retreated. He was right. Hidden in the forest, less than 400 meters from where 63 civilians huddled in the village church basement, was an entire SS reconnaissance column. 18 vehicles, maybe 70 soldiers, waiting. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a teenager with a broken mirror, some hay, and a brilliant idea saw what trained soldiers missed. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including the German commander who wrote about it in his prison memoirs. The morning of June 9th was chaos dressed up as victory. The Americans had pushed inland from Utah Beach. Sainte-Mère-Église was liberated. The stars and stripes flew over the town square. For the first time in 4 years, the people of Normandy tasted freedom. But 3 kilometers west, in the village of Les Forges, the situation was different. Not because the Germans hadn't retreated, not because the Americans hadn't advanced, but because between the liberators and the liberated sat a pocket of land no one had properly scouted. A dense forest of oak and elm, thick with undergrowth, crossed by old logging roads that didn't appear on American maps. Pierre Dubois knew those roads. He'd walked them since he was 6 years old, following his father to check rabbit snares and gather firewood. He knew which paths led to clearings, which trails dead-ended at ravines. And he knew that the main logging road, the one wide enough for vehicles, ran straight to the back of Les Forges, emerging just 200 meters from the stone church, where everyone had sheltered. When the paratroopers came through on June 8th, they'd done a quick sweep. They'd checked the main road, seen no Germans, and moved on. "Stay in your basements," the lieutenant had said in broken French. "We'll be back tomorrow to evacuate you properly. The Krauts are running east. You're safe now." But Pierre wasn't sure. He'd watched from the barn as German vehicles passed through the previous night. A lot of vehicles. They'd been moving fast, headlights off, engines straining. Heading east, yes, but something nagged at him. The convoy had been too organized for a retreat, too controlled. The soldiers hadn't looked panicked. They'd looked purposeful. At dawn on June 9th, Pierre climbed to the barn's loft. The structure was half destroyed, hit by artillery 3 days earlier, but the west wall still stood. From there, he could see across the fields to the forest edge. He brought his father's old hunting binoculars, the ones with the cracked left lens. The morning light came slowly, filtered through smoke that still drifted from burning vehicles on the main road. Pierre scanned the tree line, moving methodically from north to south, the way his father had taught him to spot deer. Then he saw it, a reflection, just a flash, there and gone, about 300 meters into the woods. Could be anything, he told himself. A puddle, a piece of shattered glass. But then he saw it again, and this time, he saw movement behind it. The slight sway of branches that weren't moving in the wind. His heart hammered. The Germans hadn't retreated, at least not all of them. Some had pulled back into the forest and stopped. But why? What were they waiting for? The answer hit him like cold water. They were waiting for the Americans to move through, let the forward units pass, then hit them from behind while simultaneously attacking less forges, trap the Americans between two forces and create chaos. Standard German tactics. His brother, before he'd been killed at Dunkirk, had described it in letters. They love to let you think you've won, he'd written. Then they spring the trap. Pierre scrambled down from the loft. He had to warn someone. But who? The Americans were gone. The resistance leader, Monsieur Beaumont, had evacuated to Sainte-Mère-Église with most of the village. Only the old, the sick, and the stubborn remained in Les Forges. 63 people hiding in the church basement, waiting for American trucks to carry them to safety. Pierre ran toward the church, but stopped halfway across the yard. German machine guns could see this field. If they spotted him running, they'd know someone was watching. They'd move up their timetable. He turned back, breath coming in gasps, mind racing. He needed to be sure. Needed to know exactly what was out there. The problem was visibility. From the barn loft, he could see the forest edge, but not into the forest. The Germans were smart, staying back in the shadows. He needed to see deeper, needed elevation, needed an angle the Germans wouldn't expect. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. Pierre Dubois was not a soldier. He was not a resistance fighter. He had no training in reconnaissance or military tactics. Before the war, before the occupation, he'd been nothing more than a farm boy who helped his father with the cows and dreamed of maybe, someday, opening a bicycle repair shop in Carentan. But Pierre had something else. He had a mind that saw problems as puzzles, and he'd spent his entire life solving the small puzzles of farm life. How to get a stubborn cow into the barn. How to reach a bird's nest without a ladder. How to see over the tall hedge to spot which field the rabbits were raiding. He sat on the barn floor, back against the wall, and forced himself to think. He needed height and concealment. He needed to observe without being observed. The barn loft was too obvious, too exposed. If the Germans had scouts watching, they'd be looking at the barn. It was the natural observation point. Pierre closed his eyes, visualizing the farm, every structure, every feature. The well, the equipment shed, the old stone wall, the haystack, the haystack. Something clicked in his mind. The haystack sat in the north field, about 80 meters from the barn. His father had built it up over the winter, and it stood maybe 4 meters tall. From ground level, it looked like a haystack. Nothing more. But if someone were inside it, looking out, they'd have an elevated view of the entire forest edge, and no one would think to watch a haystack. But how do you see out of a haystack? Hay was packed tight. You couldn't just burrow in and expect to observe anything. You'd be blind, suffocating, useless. Pierre's eyes snapped open. He knew exactly how to do it. He scrambled around the barn, gathering materials. His father's old straight razor kept sharp for cutting rope, a wooden frame from a broken cart, roughly 30 centimeters square, and most importantly, a mirror. A good-sized piece, maybe 20 centimeters across, from his mother's vanity that had been shattered by the same artillery strike that destroyed half the barn. The device he had in mind was simple, brilliant in its simplicity. A periscope. Not a military-grade periscope with precision lenses and brass fittings, but a farm-made version using the same principle. 2 mirrors set at 45-degree angles in a vertical shaft. Light enters the top, bounces off the upper mirror, travels down the shaft, bounces off the lower mirror, and exits into your eye. You can see over obstacles without exposing yourself. Submarines used them. He'd seen pictures in his brother's books, but Pierre didn't need to see over water. He needed to see out of hay. The challenge was construction. He didn't have a proper shaft. What he had was wood scraps, wire, and desperation. He worked fast, hands trembling but steady enough. He took 2 pieces of wood from the cart frame, each about a meter long, and bound them parallel with wire, creating a channel between them. Into this channel, he wedged the mirror fragments, angling them carefully. Top mirror facing down and out, bottom mirror facing up and in. When he held it up and looked into the bottom mirror, he could see what the top mirror saw. Ceiling beams. Sky through the broken roof. It worked. But it was crude. The mirrors weren't precisely angled. The view was distorted. And he'd need to burrow into the haystack without collapsing it, which meant creating a hollow space large enough for him to hide in, but stable enough not to sag and reveal itself. Pierre had done this before, in a way. When he was 10, he and his cousin had hollowed out a haystack to create a fort. His father had been furious when he'd discovered it, explaining how dangerous it was, how the whole thing could collapse and smother them. But Pierre remembered the technique. You started from the bottom, removing hay carefully, creating a cavity. You supported the roof with sticks. You left the outer layer thick enough to maintain shape. He worked for 90 minutes. The sun climbed higher. In the village, people would be waking, wondering when the Americans would return. In the forest, the Germans would be waiting, counting down to their attack window. Pierre approached the haystack from the side, facing away from the forest. He used his hands to carefully pull out compacted hay, creating an opening about 50 centimeters wide. Then he burrowed in, worming his way toward the center, pulling out more hay as he went. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and dusty and suffocating. Pieces of straw got in his eyes, his mouth, down his collar. When he'd created a space just large enough to crouch in, he reinforced the ceiling with 3 sturdy branches he'd brought from the barn. Then he sealed the entrance behind him, packing hay back into the opening, leaving just enough gap for air. Total darkness. The sound of his own breathing loud in his ears, the prickle of straw against his skin. For a moment, panic touched him. What if the whole thing collapsed? What if he couldn't get out? What if the Germans set fire to it? He forced the thoughts away, worked by feel, took his periscope and carefully pushed it upward through the hay above him, angling it toward the forest. Hay gave way slowly. The device emerged at the top of the stack. Just barely. Maybe 10 centimeters of wood and mirror sticking out, surrounded by loose straw that disguised its outline. Pierre positioned himself beneath it, sitting on compacted hay, and peered into the bottom mirror. He could see. The view was murky, distorted by the imperfect mirrors and the straw around the upper lens, but he could see. The forest edge, the tree line. And there, about 250 meters away, in the shadows beneath the oaks, shapes that weren't trees. He counted them carefully. 18 vehicles, half-tracks mostly, with at least 3 armored cars, Wehrmacht camouflage, soldiers moving between them, checking equipment, eating from mess tins, an officer consulting a map, a radio operator at his station, and all of them facing toward Les Forges. Pierre's throat went dry. This wasn't a retreating unit. This was a strike force, prepared and positioned. He scanned further along the tree line and spotted something worse. Machine gun nests. 3 of them, dug in at intervals, covering the approach from the village. If anyone tried to leave Les Forges by the main path, they'd walk straight into a killing field. He watched for another hour, documenting everything through his crude periscope. The Germans rotated guards. The officer gathered his squad leaders for a briefing. Radio man sent several transmissions. They were coordinating with someone, waiting for a signal. But Pierre also noted something crucial. The Germans weren't watching the haystack. Why would they? It was just a haystack. They watched the barn, the house, the church tower. Their sentries scanned the obvious positions. But a farm field with a pile of hay? Not worth their attention. By noon, Pierre had seen enough. He knew the German positions, their strength, their likely plan. Now he needed to get the information to someone who could act on it. The Americans, the resistance, anyone with a radio or the ability to bring force to bear. The problem was getting out of the haystack, off the farm, and to Sainte-Mère-Église without being shot. 3 kilometers of open country, most of it in German sightlines. He decided to wait for darkness, but as he sat there, cramped and sweating, another thought occurred to him. What if the Germans attacked before nightfall? What if their signal came in the next hour? 63 people in the church basement would have no warning. No chance. He had to do something now. Pierre carefully collapsed his periscope, letting it sink back into the hay. Then he began the slow process of extracting himself from the haystack, pushing hay aside, widening the cavity, finally emerging at ground level on the side facing away from the forest. He army crawled through the field to the barn, using the grain as cover. It took 20 minutes to cover 80 meters. Every moment, he expected gunfire. None came. In the barn, he found paper and a pencil. He drew a map, marked the German positions, vehicle count, machine gun nests, everything. Then he wrote a message in simple French and rougher English. Germans in forest. Attack coming. 18 vehicles. 70+ soldiers. Machine guns covering main path. Do not approach from east. Circle north through Beaumont Farm. He folded the paper, tucked it into his shirt. Then he made his decision. He couldn't run to Sainte-Mère-Église. Too far, too exposed. But he could reach the church. And if he could reach the church, maybe someone there had the courage to make the run. Someone older. Someone the Germans might not shoot on sight. Old Father Thomas, perhaps. Or Madame Rousseau, who'd been a nurse in the First War and seemed to fear nothing. Pierre waited until a cloud covered the sun, dimming the light for just a few minutes. Then he ran. Not toward the main path, but northwest, through the vegetable garden, past the old pigsty, using every scrap of cover. He'd played in this space his whole life. He knew every dip in the ground, every wall, every place where shadows fell. A shout from the forest, German voices, sharp and alarmed. They'd seen him. Pierre kept running, zigzagging, legs pumping. A shot cracked out. Bullet hit dirt 2 meters to his left. Another shot, this one closer. He dove behind the church's stone wall just as a burst of machine gun fire tore through the space he'd occupied. He pounded on the church's back door. "It's Pierre! Let me in!" The door opened instantly. Hands pulled him inside. Father Thomas, white-faced. "Boy, what are you doing? They'll kill you!" "Germans," Pierre gasped. "In the forest, waiting to attack. I saw them. At least 70 soldiers. They have machine guns covering the paths." The church basement went silent. 63 people staring at him. Some thought he was crazy. Others believed him instantly, having learned to trust bad news in a war. Father Thomas took charge. "Pierre, you're sure?" "I watched them for 3 hours from inside the haystack. I built a periscope. I saw everything. They're preparing to attack." An old man laughed bitterly. A periscope in a haystack. The boys lost his mind. But Madame Rousseau stepped forward. She'd been studying Pierre's face. "He's telling the truth. Look at him, covered in straw, hands shaking but eyes steady. He saw something." Father Thomas made the decision. "Madame Rousseau, you'll go. You're fastest, and the Germans might hesitate to shoot a woman. Take Pierre's map. Get to the Americans. Tell them what we face." What happened next entered the unofficial annals of the Normandy campaign, told around campfires and in memoirs that never quite made it to the official histories. Madame Rousseau made it to Sainte-Mère-Église in 43 minutes, running the entire way across fields and through hedgerows. She found the American command post and, in broken English supplemented by Pierre's map, explained the situation. The lieutenant was skeptical until he looked at the map. The detail was too specific to be fabricated. Vehicle positions, weapon placements, patrol patterns. He radioed for support. Within 30 minutes, a platoon of paratroopers was moving north, circling through the Beaumont farm exactly as Pierre had suggested. At the same time, 3 Sherman tanks rolled west from Sainte-Mère-Église along the main road, creating noise and drawing German attention. The Germans, hearing the tanks, assumed their position was compromised. The officer gave the order to withdraw deeper into the forest. But as they started their vehicles, the American paratroopers hit them from the north, cutting off the retreat. The battle lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, 12 Germans were dead, 43 captured, and the rest scattered into the countryside. The civilians in Les Forges were evacuated without a single casualty. The American lieutenant wrote in his report, "Enemy ambush prevented by information provided by local civilian. Source: observation from concealed position." But it was the German officer, captured and interrogated, who provided the full picture. They'd been waiting for a radio signal from a unit further east. Once received, they were to attack Les Forges simultaneously with a strike on the American supply line. The goal was to create chaos, disrupt the advance, and buy time for German reinforcements. The civilians in the church were to be used as hostages or human shields, depending on tactical necessity. "How did they know we were there?" the officer asked his interrogator. "We were perfectly concealed. We had spotters watching all the obvious positions. How?" The American lieutenant smiled. "A haystack." "What?" "You were spotted from a haystack by a kid with a homemade periscope." The German officer was silent for a long time. Then he said, "That's the most absurd thing I've heard in this entire absurd war." The impact of Pierre's observation extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. The captured German radio equipment provided intelligence about Wehrmacht communication codes. The interrogated prisoners revealed positions of other concealed units in the area. Over the next week, American forces cleared 3 more hidden German positions based on this information. Military analysts later estimated that Pierre's warning prevented what could have been a significant setback in the Allied advance. If the Germans had successfully ambushed American forces while using civilians as leverage, it would have slowed operations in that sector by days, possibly weeks. It would have cost lives, both military and civilian. But more than that, Pierre's Haystack Periscope became a minor legend among the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. They told the story to new replacements as a lesson in unconventional thinking. "Never assume you've secured an area," they'd say. "And never underestimate what a motivated civilian can do with farm equipment." The paratroopers started checking haystacks more carefully, not because they expected more periscopes, but because Pierre's story reminded them that the French resistance, the civilians, the ordinary people caught in the war, were watching and helping in ways the military couldn't always see or appreciate. 3 weeks after the incident, a sergeant tracked Pierre down to give him something. A letter of commendation from the battalion commander and a chocolate bar from the mess supplies. Pierre, who'd been helping his neighbors rebuild damaged barns, accepted both with embarrassed grace. "You saved a lot of lives, kid," the sergeant said. Pierre shrugged. "I just knew the land, and I remembered something from my brother's books about submarines. It wasn't anything special." "That's where you're wrong," the sergeant replied. "Special isn't about being trained or having equipment. Special is about seeing what needs to be done and doing it, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." The war moved on. The Allies pushed toward Paris. Pierre and his father rebuilt their farm, replacing the damaged barn, restoring the fields. Life, slowly, returned to something approaching normal. In 1947, a reporter from Paris came to Les Forges, researching civilian contributions to the liberation. Someone had mentioned the Haystack incident. The reporter found Pierre, now 19, working in his bicycle repair shop in Carentan. He'd finally achieved his pre-war dream. "Tell me about the periscope," the reporter said, notebook ready. Pierre was uncomfortable with the attention. It was just mirrors and wood. Anyone could have done it. "But you're the one who did it." "Because I knew the land. Because I'd played in that haystack before. Because my brother had books about submarines. I wasn't special. I was just a guy who happened to be in the right place with the right memories." "What do you think the real lesson is from what happened?" Pierre thought for a long moment, hands still working on a bicycle chain. "That the military, the experts, the people with training and equipment, they're good at what they do. But they can't know everything. They can't see every angle. Sometimes the answer comes from someone who's not supposed to have answers. A farm boy, a local, someone who knows things the maps don't show." The reporter wrote it all down, but the article was never published. Bigger stories, more dramatic tales, pushed Pierre's modest account aside. The war had ended. People wanted to look forward, not back. Pierre Dubois died in 1989, aged 61, of a heart attack while working in his shop. His obituary in the local paper mentioned that he'd served his community well, that he'd been a good neighbor, that he'd fought in the resistance during the occupation. It did not mention haystacks or periscopes, but in the small museum in Sainte-Mère-Église, there's a display case that few visitors notice. Inside is a crude wooden frame with 2 pieces of mirror, badly angled and held together with ancient wire. A placard explains, "Improvised periscope used by civilian to observe German positions, June 1944. Donated by the Dubois family." Next to it is a photograph. Pierre, at 19, standing in front of his bicycle shop, squinting into the sun, looking like any other young man trying to rebuild his life after a war. And there's a quote, attributed to the German officer captured that day, given during a post-war interview in 1962. "We controlled the roads. We watched the buildings. We had the superior position and better equipment. But we lost because we never thought to watch the haystacks. In war, the overlooked detail is where defeat hides." The Germans had secrets in those early weeks after D-Day. Concealed positions, hidden reserves, ambush plans. But their biggest blind spot wasn't tactical or strategic. It was perceptual. They never imagined that a 16-year-old farm boy, armed with nothing but knowledge of his own land and a child's memory of playing in haystacks, could see what all their training and experience had missed. And one French teenager, with a broken mirror and some wire, exposed that blind spot and saved 63 lives. Not because he was a hero, not because he was special, but because when everyone else had evacuated or given up or assumed safety, he stayed. He watched, and he found a way to see what needed to be seen. That's the real story of the Haystack Periscope. Not about bravery or genius, but about paying attention, about knowing your ground, about refusing to accept that just because the experts had moved on, the danger had moved on with them. Pierre Dubois saw the trap because he knew what belonged in his forest and what didn't. And when he needed to see more clearly, he didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. He built a solution from broken pieces and farm scrap, and it worked well enough. Sometimes that's all history requires. Something that works well enough, at exactly the right moment, from exactly the right person. A farm boy, a haystack, and a trick he'd learned from his brother's books about submarines. 63 lives saved, a German ambush foiled, and a reminder that wars aren't won only by armies, but by people who see what needs seeing and do what needs doing, no matter how absurd it seems to anyone else.